Corporatism is the merger between state and corporations. It's basically where big corporations can lobby government for special interest favours to get government to act in their behalf. So that the big corporations will lobby the politicians, pay off the politicians, get them to lay on more government regulations to stamp out the competition of smaller business people. That way, the big corporations can gain a foothold and monopoly over the marketplace. Meanwhile, the smaller business people cannot compete. Another name for corporatism would be crony capitalism or monopoly capitalism or state capitalism. You've probably heard these names with the use of the word capitalism in it, but it isn't capitalism. It's basically using the element of capitalism, it's strangling capitalism half to death in this mixed economy through the use of socialism in the mixed economy, so that through the use of socialism, such as the socialist government subsidies, the socialist government protectionism as a whole, they are able to monopolise the marketplace. So this is the inevitable consequence of what you're faced with this mixed economy. Government gets to pick and choose winners and losers out of it, and through government's interference, it's only natural that government ends up giving advantage to some competitors over others. So what are big corporations going to do in order to react against that? Because it's competition they're up against. Well, they are going to lobby the politicians to act in their behalf, and it becomes this, game where one is trying to gain the foothold over the other and using government to get into that position. And it just so happens to be that through the heavy government regulation, the heavier and heavier the government regulation becomes, the costlier it becomes. Meanwhile, the thousands and thousands of pages of government regulation becomes too overly complicated. No one's really going to read it. So the smaller business people cannot afford to pay people to find loopholes in the government regulation. Meanwhile, the big corporations can. The big corporations have that advantage. They're able to simply pay off people to find loopholes in the government regulation, and it enables them to gain that monopoly and foothold over the economy. And essentially, this is why you end up seeing the type of system that you're under, where you're faced with all of these cartels and monopolies, and it's done through government's intervention. You've probably heard of the terms socialising the losses and capitalising the gains, or socialising the losses and privatising the gains, or it might otherwise be known as socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. Now, a lot of people misinterpret what that means. What it means by socialising all of the losses, it basically and simply means that the big corporations, through all of that lobbying and this corporatist system being this merger and partnership between government and big corporations, all it simply means is the government is always there to protect the big corporations from their losses. So what it simply means is the fact that capitalising the gains means that the big corporations get to keep all of their gains. Meanwhile, through all of the losses that big corporations make, it's the government that's paying for it. So they get to live for free off of all of their own losses. So how does government pay for it? Well, government will subsidise. It will force the taxpayer to collectively pay for it. Now, I say collectively pay for it, and it's important to understand the difference between capitalism and, of course, this system that we live under today. So, I will, of course, get around to explaining that, but just understand that they are forcing the taxpayer into a collective group, and they're forcing the taxpayer to collectively pay for the losses of others, right? So through a socialist government subsidy, they are forcing tax money out of the taxpayers and redistributing to pay for the losses of big corporations. So that means that the big corporations are getting to live for free off of all of their own losses. There are consequences for this, because this was precisely what led on the road to the banking crisis, because of what we call legally protected fraud. Because there are two things that creditors have to take concern about. One is risk, and two is return. If you are an investor, you're going to be concerned about the risk that you make in your investment, because for all you know, that investment that you make might not make any money. You might in fact make losses out of it. So that's the risk, right? That's the risk that you face. The other, thing that you're going to be concerned about as an investor is your return. Are you going to make a profit from that investment? That's what you're concerned about. You're concerned about when you make an investment, you want to ensure that you're going to make a return on it. You're going to make a profit on it, right? So these are the things that, investors, creditors are concerned with. When you get a government to step in there through a subsidy, through socialist government subsidies, the government takes that risk away. The risk is gone because the government's saying, don't worry about it. Don't worry about any investments that you make. Don't worry about, whatever we tell you to invest in. At the end of the day, we will protect you from your losses. A good example of this was precisely what resulted in the housing crash of 2008, the housing crisis, because they artificially lowered the interest rates. So of course more and more people are going to go out and search for houses, aren't they? Demand is going to drive up, right? They were issuing out cheap credit, and people were being encouraged to go out and buy houses during a period when there's a housing shortage. So what happens when there's a shortage? Demand drives up, the cost spirals out of control. However, the main issue was the fact that government would say to the creditors, you know what? I want you to make an investment in building 250,000 homes, and through your investment, don't worry if you make any losses from it. We will secure that. We will get the taxpayer to foot the bill. And this was precisely what resulted in what we saw of the banking crisis, because when government takes that risk away, you're faced with legally protected fraud, where the bankers feel that they can get away with doing anything that they like, issuing out cheap credit at free will, and they feel they can just do as they please. So this is the issue, because it was that which led to the bad banks becoming too big to fail because of all the government subsidies. So at the end of the day, when you take away the risk of the creditors, you're going to create incompetence. Now, there were many examples of government subsidies that resulted in bankruptcy throughout the 19th century in the United States of America. You saw it in the railroad industry, you saw it in the turnpike industry, you saw it in the steamship industry. Take, for example, Edward Collins and his steamships. His business ended up going into bankruptcy because he wasted so much from being given subsidies from Congress, and Congress eventually gets sick of him, and eventually he would go into bankruptcy. Another fine example of the government subsidy, in order to help you understand, there was the North Pacific Railroad Company in the 1860s. Now, this was a perfect example, because just like the example I gave on the economic calculation problem, and you saw where there was the root that would either go through the mountains or, of course, round it. Well, this was a real world scenario in the United States. It wasn't really, and I can't really say it was to do with the economic calculation problem, but the incompetence that you would see stemmed from government subsidies. Because the North Pacific Railroad Company ended up building a railroad that would go, around the mountain and took the longer route. Most importantly, they used poor quality materials for building the railroad. And although they completed and finished the railroad, I think it was poor weather conditions that ended up causing damage, and they couldn't afford to repair it. So it was more or less finished, and they would go bankrupt before they were even able to open it. Now, what resulted in such incompetency? Well, what government said, don't worry about it. For every 1 mile of track that you build, we will guarantee you a $1,000 odd subsidy. So in other words, there's no incentive there for them to work hard, to be competent, because at the end of the day, they're guaranteed money in hand. If you're guaranteed money in hand of over a $1,000 subsidy, you're not going to be concerned about, efficiency. Because at the end of the day, you're guaranteed free money, free handouts. That's what this subsidy is. So that was the serious problem that the North Pacific Railroad Company was faced with, and they faced bankruptcy by 1873. So when James J. Hill stepped in and he took over, and don't forget the North Pacific Railroad Company had ignored the neighbours. They weren't interested in the neighbours surrounding them from where they were building the railroad. They didn't take any interest. Meanwhile, the free marketeer, James J. Hill, built the only successful railroad known as the Great Northern Railroad. It cut right through the Rockies, and of course, James J. Hill managed to successfully build it at a cheaper cost, more efficiently with better quality materials. He even greatly benefited the neighbours that he would build the railroad through. He said if they would farm around his railroads, he would give them something in return. That's the difference between the capitalism with efficiency to that of the North Pacific Railroad Company with government subsidies. So what you see here is the government subsidy resulted in incompetency. It resulted in inefficiency and eventual bankruptcy. And you see it time and time and time and time again. It's a system that rewards failure and punishes success. It punishes success because success is not allowed to come through in the marketplace that would be more efficient, and it keeps on rewarding failure. How does it reward failure? Well, at the end of the day, like I say, the taxpayer's always forced to continuously bail it out. You saw it with the British coal industry. They tried to keep on, bailing that out. Thankfully, Margaret Thatcher stepped in and privatised and prevented subsidies taking place in that and allowed it to fail. Because that's what you're supposed to do. And here's the difference between capitalism and corporatism. Capitalism's a system that rewards success and punishes failure. If you run a private business and you end up making losses, you're paying for your own losses, whether you like it or not. Because in the capitalist system, each and every single individual is financially responsible over their own money, and they earn 100% of their own earnings. And through the capitalist system, they are responsible over how they run business. And what the capitalist system does, it allows you to fail. That's not a bad thing. Why is it not a bad thing? Because if your business fails, you can always start up another business and learn from your mistakes. Now, the period of the robber barons was in relation, and I explained in a video. And you can watch the video that I explained everything to do with the robber barons period, right? And I also did another video on the antitrust laws, right? So I would more than love for you to check out the two videos that I had provided, one on the robber barons myth, the other in the antitrust laws. The reason it's important to understand these is because what it shows you is that it wasn't capitalism that would lead on the road to this system we have today. Right? And I'm not saying there's any such thing as a perfect system. There's no such thing as perfection. But we do know the solution to prevent corporatism from forming, and it's done through the free market. It's done through preventing government from interference in the marketplace. You are never going to stop the monopoly creation through government intervention. That's what creates the monopolies. And a fine example would be the American Medical Association monopoly in 1904 that was granted by the United States government. And that monopoly ended, leading to the closure of 168 medical schools, so there was fewer medical doctors available on the market, a vast increase of the US population, therefore a vast increase of consumer demand for medical treatment, and the cost of medical costs soared out of control simply because of government's created monopoly. When you lift the heavy government regulation off people's backs and you strongly deregulate the economy, what you open up is competition and consumer choice, and it's through those two things alone that enable you to prevent the monopolies from forming, because it's through strong consumer choice and fierce competition that's going to prevent the monopolies. And again, look at Standard Oil. He had, competition on his back, and one of the main competitors he was faced with in the 1870s was the producer and seller of the electric light bulb. He wasn't able to shaft the consumer and drive up the cost like the famous monopoly myths that they claimed about, Standard Oil. So, if you would like to learn more about corporatism, if you've got any other questions that you would like to ask me on the entire subject, then of course I will try and get back to you. I hope that's been educational enough for yourself, and of course, thank you for listening and watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.